Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're going to be diving deep into Edmund Burke's reflections on the Revolution in France. This book, published in 1790, is really a passionate response to the events that were unfolding in the French Revolution and a profound exploration of political philosophy in general.
You know what I think is so fascinating about Reflections is that it's not just a historical document. It's really a timeless reflection on the nature of society itself, government, and the dangers of radical change. And Burke grapples with these fundamental questions that are still relevant today, things like the balance between individual rights and social order, the role of tradition and institutions, and even just the limits of human reason.
Yeah, so, for our listeners who maybe aren't as familiar with Burke, could you just give us a quick overview of the book's main themes? What's the big picture?
Sure, yeah. So in essence, Burke is arguing that society is like a complex organism. It's something that's built over generations, not a machine that you can just kind of re-engineer at will. And so he saw the French Revolution's attempt to just sweep away centuries of tradition and rebuild society from scratch as reckless and ultimately destructive. And he was very skeptical of these abstract rights of man ideas when they're detached from historical context and practical considerations.
Interesting. So he's not necessarily against all revolution or change, but he's cautioning against a certain kind of radical utopian thinking.
Exactly. Burke really believed that change should be gradual. It should be organic and rooted in institutions that already exist. And he saw the French Revolution as a cautionary tale about the dangers of abstract ideology and just the arrogance of assuming we can simply design a perfect society based on reason alone.
I see. So where do we even start in unpacking this complex book? What were Burke's main concerns about the French Revolution?
Well, Burke was obviously deeply troubled by all the violence and upheaval of the revolution, but his critique goes much deeper than that. He saw the revolution as a symptom of a dangerous trend. The rise of these abstract, universal rights of man detached from real concrete circumstances and historical traditions.
Okay, so let's dive into that a little bit. What was so concerning about these abstract rights to him? I mean, don't we all believe in basic human rights?
Of course. But Burke's concern was with the way that these rights were being framed and implemented. He believed that real rights aren't these abstract principles that are just floating out there, but rather concrete entitlements embedded in the fabric of society and its laws, customs, and institutions.
So he's not saying that rights are unimportant,
Hmm.
but that they need to be grounded in the real world and the complexities of human society.
Precisely. He was really concerned that these abstract rights, when divorced from this context, could just as easily be used to justify tyranny as they could be used to promote liberty. In fact, one of the most famous passages in the book is where Burke warns that the effect of liberty to individuals is that they may do what they please. We ought to see what it will please them to do before we risk congratulations, which may be soon turned into complaints.
Wow, you can really feel that worry there, that granting absolute freedom without considering the consequences could backfire dramatically.
Right, and this is where his defense of tradition comes in. Burke saw tradition not as mindless adherence to the past, but as a repository of accumulated wisdom, a kind of collective memory that helps us navigate the complexities of human affairs. He believed that institutions and customs, while imperfect, embody the lessons learned over generations of trial and error.
That's interesting. So he's not saying we should blindly follow tradition, but that we should respect it and learn from it.
Exactly. Burke believed that true progress is built on a foundation of existing institutions, not on their total destruction. He saw the French Revolution's attempt to just wipe the slate clean and start over as a form of dangerous hubris, like a rejection of the wisdom of the past.
I see. So for Burke, respecting tradition doesn't mean being stuck in the past. It means building on the foundations of what's come before. It's about evolution, not revolution.
Exactly. And this brings us to another key theme in the book, the importance of property. Burke really believed that the protection of private property was essential for social stability and the preservation of liberty.
Why was property so central to his argument? I mean, was he just defending the interests of the wealthy?
Not exactly. While Burke certainly believed in the rights of property owners, his defense of property went far beyond narrow economic interests. He saw property as a stabilizing force in society, a source of independence and responsibility.
So for Burke, property is not just about wealth. It's about having a stake in the system, a vested interest in maintaining order and stability.
You got it. Burke believed that property ownership fosters a sense of attachment to place community and the social fabric. He argued that those who have property are more likely to be responsible citizens, invested in the long-term well-being of their community.
This idea of property as a stake in the system, I mean, it really resonates. Do you think it still holds true today?
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? Do people feel as connected to their communities when homeownership is declining? And so much of our wealth is tied up in intangible assets. That's definitely something to ponder.
Absolutely. So we've talked about Burke's concerns with abstract rights, his defense of tradition, and the importance of property. What else stood out to you in these early parts of Reflections? What sets the stage for his full-blown critique of the French Revolution?
Early on, Burke expresses deep concern about the Revolution Society in England. He worries that they're getting too caught up in the fervor of what's happening in France, and that they are misunderstanding the principles of the 1688 Glorious Revolution in England.
Ah, yes, the Glorious Revolution. Can you remind us and our listeners what was so glorious about it, and why did it matter so much to Burke?
Sure. The Glorious Revolution, as you may recall, is when James II was deposed and replaced by William and Mary. But for Burke, it wasn't about a radical overthrow of the monarchy. It was about preserving the essence of the English Constitution while making some necessary adjustments.
So it was more about course correction than a complete upheaval.
Exactly. And that's why Burke was so frustrated with the Revolution Society. He felt they were misinterpreting the Glorious Revolution as a justification for sweeping away all existing institutions, rather than reforming them from within.
So he saw the Glorious Revolution as a model of gradual, pragmatic reform, in stark contrast to the French Revolution's radicalism.
Precisely. And that's a theme that we'll see play out throughout Reflections. This deep suspicion of radical change, and a strong preference for a more cautious, incremental approach to reform.
This is all so fascinating, and I'm eager to dive deeper into Burke's specific criticisms of the French Revolution's events and figures. But for now, let's take a short break, and we'll pick up this conversation about Reflections on the Revolution in France in just a moment.
Picking up where we left off, I think it's so important to understand that Burke's critique of the French Revolution wasn't just theoretical. I mean, he was deeply disturbed by the actual events that were happening, the attacks on traditional institutions.
Right. It wasn't just ideas for him. He was witnessing a real social and political earthquake, and he was horrified by the human cost.
Exactly. And one of the most vivid and disturbing passages in Reflections is his account of the October days in 1789, when a mob of Parisians, many of them women, marched to Versailles and forced the royal family to return to Paris.
Yeah, it's a chilling scene. The image of the king and queen being dragged back to Paris by an angry mob, it really captures that sense of chaos and breakdown of order that Burke was so worried about.
Absolutely. Burke saw those October days as a stark illustration of the dangers of unchecked popular passion. He believed that the revolutionaries had unleashed forces that they couldn't control, and that this kind of mob violence, fueled by resentment and envy, would become a recurring feature of revolutionary politics. And this really gets to the heart of his fears about what happens when the social fabric is torn apart.
When you say social fabric, it feels like something Burke mentions but doesn't really define explicitly.
You're right to pick up on that. He doesn't offer a neat definition. But when he talks about the social fabric, he's referring to this complex web of relationships, institutions, traditions, values, the things that hold a society together. It's about a sense of shared identity, mutual respect, a commitment to the common good.
So for Burke, it's not just about individual rights. It's about the bonds that connect individuals into a community.
Precisely. And he believed that the French Revolution was tearing those bonds apart, leading to a dangerous form of atomized individualism, where people are encouraged to see themselves as isolated units in conflict with each other, rather than as members of a shared society.
Right, and I'm starting to see how this connects back to his anxieties about those abstract rights. If everyone is focused on their own individual rights, what happens to the sense of collective responsibility?
That's a great point. Burke feared that this relentless focus on individual rights would erode the sense of duty, obligation, shared sacrifice that he saw as essential for a functioning society. He believed that a healthy society requires a balance between individual rights and social responsibilities.
Which brings us back to his defense of tradition, right?
Yeah.
Because for Burke, tradition wasn't just about clinging to the past. It was about preserving the wisdom, the social norms, the moral framework that had evolved over generations to keep that balance.
Exactly. And this brings us to another key aspect of Burke's critique: his profound concern about the revolution's attack on the church and the undermining of religious faith.
Right. I'd almost forgotten how central religion was to Burke's whole worldview. Can you unpack that a bit?
Mm.
Why is he so worried about the decline of religion in revolutionary France?
Well, Burke saw religion as the foundation of virtue and social order. He believed that religious faith provided a moral compass, a sense of humility, a framework for understanding our place in the world. And he feared that the revolutionaries' attempts to replace religious faith with this purely secular, rationalistic worldview would have disastrous consequences for society.
So for Burke, it wasn't just about defending a particular religion, it was about the role of religion in general,
Yeah.
as a source of moral guidance and social perfusion.
Precisely. He believed that a society without a strong religious foundation would inevitably descend into chaos and immorality. And this wasn't just about personal morality, it was about the moral framework that underpins a healthy society.
It's interesting how his anxieties about the decline of religion echo some of the concerns we hear today about the rise of secularism and the potential consequences for social cohesion.
Yeah, it's a fascinating parallel. Of course, the context is different. But those underlying questions are surprisingly similar. What happens when a society loses its shared moral compass? What fills the void when traditional sources of authority and meaning decline? These are questions that we're still grappling with today.
This brings us to another element of Burke's analysis that I think resonates with contemporary concerns. His lament for the age of chivalry. He saw the French Revolution's rejection of traditional manners, social graces, respect for authority, as a sign of moral and cultural decay.
Yeah, Burke famously lamented, the age of chivalry is gone. That of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever. He felt that something precious had been lost. A sense of honor, duty, respect for the dignity of others.
And I think we can all relate to that sense of loss in some way. It's like he's mourning a decline in civility, a coarsening of public discourse, a loss of respect for the things that used to bind people together.
Exactly. He worried that the revolutionaries' focus on this cold, calculating reason, devoid of sentiment and tradition, would lead to a society that was maybe efficient, but ultimately cold, heartless, inhumane.
It's interesting how he connects that loss of chivalry with the rise of sophisters, economists, and calculators. It's like he's anticipating a world dominated by a purely utilitarian mindset,
Mm-hmm.
where everything is reduced to cost-benefit analysis. And there's no room for sentiment beauty tradition, kind of like what you mentioned earlier when we were talking about the role of property in society.
You're absolutely right to make that connection. For Burke, the loss of chivalry wasn't just about bad manners. It was about a fundamental shift in values, a move away from a society grounded in virtue, honor, a sense of the sacred, toward a more materialistic, individualistic, and utilitarian worldview. And he was deeply concerned about the long-term consequences of that shift.
So to sum up, Burke's critique of the French Revolution wasn't just about specific policies or events. It was about a fundamental clash of worldviews, a clash between a traditional hierarchical society grounded in religion tradition and a sense of duty, and a new emerging world based on individual rights reason and a more egalitarian ethos.
That's a great summary. And while Burke clearly sided with that more traditional worldview, he wasn't blind to its flaws. He acknowledged the need for reform, for adjustments to changing circumstances, but he believed that those reforms should be rooted in existing institutions and traditions, not in a radical break with the past.
I see. So for Burke, it wasn't about resisting change altogether, but about making sure that change was guided by wisdom, prudence, and a deep respect for the complexity of human affairs.
Exactly, and I think that's one of the most enduring lessons of Reflections. It reminds us that while progress is possible, it's a delicate and often perilous process, and that these radical attempts to remake society from scratch, however well-intentioned, often lead to unintended consequences.
So what can we learn from Burke's reflections today, in a world that's still grappling with these questions of revolution reform and the balance between individual rights and social order?
That's a big question, and one that we'll explore in our next segment. But I think one key takeaway is that we should approach political and social change with a healthy dose of humility and a deep awareness of the complexities that we're dealing with.
As we've been talking about Burke's reflections, I've been struck by how relevant his ideas still feel today. We live in a time of rapid social and technological change. And there's a lot of debate about the best way to navigate all this. Some people are calling for radical solutions, and others are advocating for a more cautious approach. It's like we're still wrestling with some of the same dilemmas that Burke was grappling with over 2 centuries ago.
Yeah, I think you're right. It really speaks to the enduring power of Burke's work. He wasn't just responding to the events of his own time. He was really grappling with these fundamental questions about human nature. about society, about the limits of political action. And those questions are still with us today, maybe even more so in our fast-paced, interconnected world.
So what are some of the key takeaways from reflections that we can apply to our own time? Like, what wisdom can we glean from Burke's analysis, even if we don't agree with everything he said?
Well, I think one of the most important lessons is that we need to have a certain amount of humility when we're approaching political and social change. Burke reminds us that we're not starting from scratch. We're inheriting this complex web of institutions, traditions, values that have evolved over generations. And so while those institutions may need to be reformed or adapted, we should approach that task with a lot of caution and a deep respect for the wisdom that's embodied in the past. It makes me wonder, what traditions or institutions do you think we take for granted today? And what would Burke say about some of these calls to dismantle them?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think we often forget how much we rely on the accumulated wisdom of previous generations. You know, we assume that we're smarter or more enlightened than our ancestors, but Burke reminds us that we're standing on their shoulders and that we should be really careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly. And another key takeaway from Reflections is this idea of interconnectedness. Burke saw society as an organic whole, not just this collection of isolated individuals. And he believed that our rights and freedoms are inextricably linked to our responsibilities to one another and to the community as a whole. In today's world where individualism is so often celebrated, I think that's a really important message to keep in mind. Do you think this constant focus on individual rights leaves any room for a sense of shared responsibility?
Right. I think it's a really crucial point. And it connects back to something we were talking about earlier, this idea of the social fabric. Burke was so worried that the French Revolution was tearing apart the very bonds that hold society together. We see similar anxieties today. Concerns about social fragmentation, political polarization, the erosion of trust in institutions.
Absolutely. And that leads to another important insight from Reflections: the danger of utopian thinking. Burke was deeply skeptical of these grand schemes to remake society based on abstract principles. He believed that human nature is flawed, that societies are complex, and that there are no easy solutions to social problems. He reminds us that even the best-intentioned reforms can have unintended consequences, and that we should be wary of those who claim to have all the answers.
Right, and this is where his skepticism of those abstract rights of man comes in. He wasn't against rights, but he was concerned that these abstract rights, when they're detached from concrete circumstances and historical traditions, could be used to justify all sorts of excesses.
Precisely. Burke believed that real rights are not these abstract principles floating around out there, but rather concrete entitlements embedded in the fabric of society, in its laws, customs, institutions. And he worried that abstract rights, when divorced from this context, could become a weapon in the hands of demagogues and fanatics. Does that resonate with you at all, given some of the things we see happening around us today?
It really does. We see this playing out in these debates about free speech, religious liberty, even property rights. There's often this tension between upholding individual rights and protecting the common good. And Burke's insights remind us that there's no easy formula for resolving these tensions. It requires careful deliberation, a balancing of competing interests, a willingness to compromise.
I think that's a great way to sum up the enduring relevance of Burke's Reflections. It's a book that challenges us to think deeply about the complexities of political and social life, to be wary of easy answers and utopian schemes, and to approach change with this mixture of hope and humility. What final thoughts would you leave our listeners with about Burke's ideas in this pivotal moment in history?
I would say that. While Burke's warnings about the dangers of radical change might seem a bit overblown to some, I think his insights into human nature, the importance of tradition, the fragility of social order, are just as relevant today as they were in the 18th century. His reflections on the revolution in France isn't just a historical document. It's a timeless reflection on the challenges of building and sustaining a just and flourishing society. And I would encourage all of our listeners to check it out and to see what insights they can find in it for themselves. Thanks for joining us on another episode of Books and Bytes.